Beth Sherman, and I am the vicar here at St. Augustine's and one of the chaplains on campus. And I first, it wasn't really met, but was moved by the presence of Silverman LaRose, who is the assistant director of the Tomaquag Museum, so it's great to have you, but I just want to say a few things. I first ran across Silverman a little over a year ago when she gave a land acknowledgement in advance of one of the honors colloquium lectures here at URI. And I have to tell you, and I've said this to you, I was so moved by how she interwove story, her own story, and history, and then land acknowledgement. It was beautifully intertwined, and I thought, I need to meet this woman. And so back in April, a small group of Episcopal clergy gathered at the Tomaquag, and Silverman was our host, and we had a tour, and then she spent a good lick of time with us answering questions. And at the end, she said, my dad was the minister at the Narragansett Indian Church, and you all are welcome to come anytime. And my ears perked up, and so I and some of my people have been going fairly regularly since the summer to this beautiful, I mean, it's a beautiful edifice. It's an old stone, 300 years old, on tribal lands in Charlestown. But it's beautiful in so many other ways too. The welcome we've received whenever we come it's profound and heartwarming. So I'm really grateful that you suggested that we do that. And what it's meant for me and for some of us is it's enlarged our circle, because we've gotten to know Silvermoon's mom, who's here tonight, Star, and Silvermoon's sister, Crystal, who more often than not, I think, gives the message, and it's always powerful and packed with history and scripture. And Wanda, your cousin, Wanda Hopkins, who is on staff here at URI. So the circle just kind of keeps getting bigger. And I know for me, just the beginning, I hope, of a long and wonderful kind of ever-growing connection and relationship with you all. So tonight, Silvermoon is going to give us some history of the Narragansett Nation, and then lead us into her talk about water is life, the deep indigenous connection to water. And then we'll have ample time for questions as well. So please, it is my privilege to welcome Silvermoon LaRose. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Silvermoon LaRose. I am a member of the Narragansett tribe, and like Pastor Sherman said, I am the assistant director at the Tomaquag Museum, but I'm also one of our cultural educators. So at the museum, we believe in teaching the history and culture and life ways of the people of southern New England. So we aren't focused directly on the Narragansett tribe. We really tend to be more regional, but we believe very strongly in teaching from a first-person perspective. So that's why, as a Narragansett woman, it gets very Narragansett heavy when I am presenting. So I was asked to share this presentation, Water is Life, but we wanted to kind of orient you to the community here, the tribal community. So we're going to start a little bit with some of the history of the Narragansett. And this is not to be braggadocious, but the Narragansett were the most largest and powerful nation in the region when we look back historically pre-contact. And as such, it allowed us some leverage, some political power in our area. And there were many other tribal communities around us, and those nations paid tribute to the Narragansett. because of our political alliances, military alliance, trade through the tribal community. The communities of the Wampanoag, which were many bands that kind of have fallen under that Wampanoag banner, but they were many bands of that community, and they paid tribute to the Narragansett. The Niantic communities paid tribute, the Nipmuc. So there was a lot of political power that the Narragansett held in this region. Being a tributary nation is not always a great time for everybody. You do get the benefits of having this community as your allies, but you also have to give something up for that. So there were mixed feelings about being tributary nations. And it's part of the reason why other groups sought new allyship with the Europeans as they started to settle in our communities. Our government structure. Semi-democracy. You could be born into the position of sachem, into the position of chief. It could be something that passed down generationally to your children, but it had to be earned. If you were not a good leader, your community would just up and leave you. And you're only a leader so long as you have someone to lead. Likewise, women could be leaders in our community. They were known as squaw sachems. And those sachems that were female had as much power as any man. They led people into war. They were not seen as men. That's the difference. You didn't, in some other cultures, it was because they were like becoming men to take on those roles, but not in ours. You were very much allowed to keep your feminine qualities about you, but you could still be a leader. You could take your community into war if necessary. You were, there are Native women leaders in our history that gained their leadership by being good at it, not by being born into those roles. So we had a semi-democratic governing system because the people did have power over their leadership. They were able to declare who could lead them, if they wanted to follow that person or not. But once they gave their allegiance to that leader, they really backed them up and allowed them to lead and make decisions on behalf of the community. But it was also influenced by your council of warriors, your war chiefs, but also your elders council. And we continue those practices today. We still have that same type of governing body. We have our chief, we have our council, we have our elders council, and they do still influence and impact decisions made today. Land management. Sometimes when we talk about, when we hear Native communities talked about, it was almost as if we were all free on these lands, and the lands, Native people didn't own the lands. No, we didn't own the lands as in having titles and deeds to it, but we did have very clear boundaries on what areas were under the management of what tribal communities. And so for there to be a sharing of use of land, treaties had to be made between those two groups that would outline the details of what you were allowed to do when you were on another community's managed lands. And this really helps to put into perspective the treaties that were made with early Europeans. These treaty agreements had already been made for thousands of years between tribal communities for use of land, a shared use. And so we even have in documentation from Roger Williams talking about he was given use of land, but Europeans then took that use and wrote up deeds, land deeds, deeds of sale, that were written in their language, signed by our leaders with bows and arrows, my Antinomy and Canonicus, who they were not able to read and write, so it was being interpreted to you what you were signing. And the understanding from our part is this is use of land, because guess what? We weren't going anywhere. We stayed. It was still our land. So we can very much look at the actions of history to understand the mindsets of the people that were going into these agreements with one another. When Europeans first started coming, this has been a constant migration of explorers since the 1524, with the arrival of Giovanni de Verrazzano, who spent 15 days in what is now Narragansett Bay, amongst the Narragansett people. From that time on, there were many others who journeyed and came in and out of these lands, and with them, they brought sicknesses from their communities that decimated native populations here. They also captured native people, kidnapped them, and took them back to Europe. So there was already an understanding that these people were coming, and they weren't always coming in a good way, but they had the ability to keep coming back in more and more numbers. So when the Mayflower came and they actually stayed this time, there was an understanding that even though this was a crew of people that were coming pretty much in a bad way after having an awful time on the ocean, 70% of the women that came with them died that first winter. So there were many children and teenagers and men. That was pretty much their whole group. So even though they didn't have much strength, the communities knew these were people coming from lands with many other people besides, and they're going to keep coming. The Wampanoag saw this as an opportunity to build new allies with nations outside of the Narragansett, and that would boost their own political standing. So that is where they were looking to build a relationship there. The Narragansett were feeling it out, because there's some mixed feelings about these new people. These new people that had been coming were coming with a certain mindset, built off of what's known as the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is a series of papal bulls. They started as early as 1100s, and they continued. And really, the most notable ones that we know from our history here in America are around 1455 with Pope Nicholas V. He authorized the enslavement of local people. Whenever you went to a new place to colonize that place, if they were not Christian, you could enslave them. And that was ordained by God. This was divine right to conquest, that God wanted you to have this, and that you had the right to do that. And so the church ordained that. In 1493, Pope Alexander, he justified that if you discovered lands, if those lands and waters were not ruled by Christian communities, you had dominion over those lands. And anything that you needed to do to take control was well within your right and ordained by God. So this is the mindset of people coming to these lands, that God had set these lands aside for them by any means necessary. And we started to see the effects of that early on in our interactions with Europeans. So even though these communities were building allies with these nations, they knew that this is a tricky business. We have to be careful in how we make these relationships, because we know it doesn't always go well. Roger Williams, he was permitted use of land by the Narragansetts. He founded what is now Providence Plantations. Much of what we know about his interaction with the Narragansett, he wrote in A Key to the Language of America in 1634. And it is an important book to our community because it documents language and cultural practice. But his goal was also somewhat propaganda. He was trying to build like support for this new colony that he was putting together. This was his vision of a land that would allow for freedom of religious expression. And so he was trying to convert Narragansett people to Christianity. So when you read the book, much of it is his interpretation of our cultural practices as heathenistic, and our language into Christianity and Christian teachings, prayers, to try to bring us over away from our satanic practice to God. But really the ultimate goal was land. It was to be able to get land. And so the royal charter granted by King Charles in 1663 says a few interesting things about how they really looked at this relationship with Native people. The goal was religious conversion. Even though he founded the state to be free for religious expression, really the underlying goal was we can try to convert them to our belief systems. Sovereignty and land ownership, the goal was to purchase and take over lands from Native people, despite the fact that Roger Williams himself said they will sell it by no means, so we'll win it with love. What does that mean? The coexistence in business, that we can have a friendly society with the Narragansett people, we'll try to get along, but if force and violence becomes necessary, you can invade and destroy native lands, enemies of other colonies, that's okay if that becomes necessary in the establishment of this new colony.
Yes.
So the relationships were tentative at best between Native people and these newcomers to this land. There was attempts at a sort of friendship, I believe, but that friendship, there were things that both sides wanted for themselves in that friendship. So it made for difficult interactions when you have other groups coming in that just want what they want. And so as more and more land became demanded from new colonists arriving to the Americas, it started to build more issues with the Native people that they had made these land agreements with, because they needed and wanted more. The Narragansett had remained neutral when the war broke out, when the Wampanoag declared war, the start of the King Philip's War. The Narragansett had remained neutral at first, and it wasn't until their community was attacked, the Great Swamp Massacre, that's right around the corner here, where anywhere between 500 to 1,000, they are not entirely sure, but these were mostly women and children and elders. This was an encampment of our non-fighting members of the community who were encamped in the swamp for a particular reason. Has anyone ever gotten lost in the swamp before? So if you don't know your way around that area, it's hard to find your way in and out. So they were thought to be safe in that place. And unfortunately, they had guides that led them in, and they killed all of the people there. And they called it the Great Swamp Fight right up till like a year ago. This was a massacre. There was nobody fighting back. Those who escaped sought refuge with the Niantic people, but it was this act that really kicked off the Narragansett's entrance into the war led by Canonship. Oh, and that's a huge jump in history because I don't have a lot of time. Long story short, we lost the war. And in the time that happened after that war, many indigenous people were sold into slavery. It was Roger Williams' idea as retribution that we be taken as indentured servants to serve a period of time working off to these colonist families for what they had lost during the war. That's an interesting concept because indentured servitude is a period of time that you serve and then you're freed. But if they put you onto boats headed out of Newport to the Azores and the West Indies, you were now enslaved for life. And that's where many of our community members went of the southern New England region. They were shipped out of here and thereby enslaved for life in these other places. Those who remained and were indentured got moved to all places as far north as New Hampshire, down into Virginia. So there was a big disbursement of Native people. But not everybody fought in the King Philip's War, and that's what people forget. There were praying towns. These were praying Indians. They were communities of Native people that had already begun to adopt Christianity. They had already begun the processes of somewhat assimilating. They were still living in the old way, but they were starting to worship in Christian and learn more about Christian teachings. So they were actually protected during the war. And that protection was interesting. Deer Island is a big story of that, where they put a community on Deer Island and they basically left them there to starve, and people started kidnapping off of them out of there and sending them into slavery. So that's an interesting way of protecting a people. But there were communities that did not fight. And so after the King Philip's War, they were not included in those that were enslaved or taken as indentured servants. And there was more of them than we think. In fact, there's documentation in the 1700s, early 1700s, talking about you were more likely to pass a native person walking down Westminster than you were to pass a white person. So we were still around, despite for years they've been telling us, oh, they all disappeared, decimated them, small population. No, there were actually still a good number of native people here. But there was a concerted effort to erase those people as nations, because if you were no longer deemed indigenous, then the treaties that were made with your communities no longer had to be enforced. And that's when they started to relabel indigenous people as mulatto, as Negro, to try a paper genocide of our communities. And if you mixed with any other nationality, that was basically it. That was giving them even more credence to be able to change over your identity. So in all of that period of history, it became very difficult for people to live in this area. And the area that was Providence, that is now Providence, they started making laws. Native people had to have guardians. They couldn't walk at night outside. There were laws, no one should suffer an Indian to build a wigwam on their land. So you weren't even allowed to put up your housing in the area. There were laws made around the state where you couldn't peel the bark from trees. All resources that we needed for survival, laws against fishing, laws against hunting as indigenous people, specifically geared towards making it impossible for us to survive here. And it made us have to adapt. And so some communities started to integrate, some left. There were communities of Narragansett people who went and settled in New York. Others went and moved into Wisconsin. They're known as the Brothertown Indians of Wisconsin. They are Narragansett people that left here and moved to those places and set up new communities there. And our territory here in New England got smaller and smaller. And in Rhode Island, going from having the majority of the state, what was held by our tribal government was only around 3,000 acres left in Charlestown by 1866. And we held this property as a community. It was not privately owned by members. There had been more land originally, but much of that was slowly seeping away by bad business deals and gambling by King Tom Ninigret, who is an interesting character because he was removed from here as a child. He went to England, he studied abroad. So he had basically been raised as a white person and was told he was the king of his nation as the tribal heir, as the chief heir. Well, we don't have a monarchy. So all the tribal land is not yours to be selling. It is owned communally by the tribal body, and he had lost a significant number of acreage over a very short period of time. And so the tribe had been consistently fighting those illegal sales of their land. When they were finally able to put a stop to it, only that 3,000 acres remained. And so we had been living on that land. That's where our Narragansett Indian church is, where we had the Narragansett schoolhouse. We had formed our own community there. We had homesteads throughout. Our tribal government, they controlled who could farm and settle on what spaces, so they kind of managed the land around the community. They gave permissions for, you could pay 10 cents for a permit to be able to cut some of the cedar in the Great Cedar Swamps and that would help to support your family. They created welfare systems that if you would take in a widow or an orphan child, they would give you a portion of those cedars that you could cut and sell as lumber to pay for their care. So we had our own complete governing system going on. And the town of Charlestown in the state of Rhode Island was like, this is really weird. We have this whole separate nation that has allegiance to another government outside of ours, operating in our state, and they have these 3,000 acres of great land in Charlestown, and they're not paying taxes on it, and that's not fair. They literally said that's not fair. That we had a benefit they did not have because we didn't have to pay taxes. Mind you, we were not citizens, so we do not get any of the benefits of being citizens. So they had the idea of detribalizing us. And this was something that wasn't unique to Rhode Island. This is what was happening with allotment acts, the Dawes Act, the removal acts that were removing Native people from their land, finding ways of getting land from them. So detribalization practices were happening in other places, being implemented in other places. So they talked about doing it to us. And they held conversations at the State House with our community. And I love this quote by a tribal elder. I believe it was Benjamin Thomas, but I can't say for sure. And all of it's good. But I love this part. What they wanted to do was give us status as Negroes, because they're like, oh, we'll give you, you'll be citizens, but you'll get Negro status. And they were acting like that's doing you a favor because you're going to be citizens. And they said, having visited many states and have seen many men, both white and black, we have heard much said about the rights of the Negro, of Negro citizenship and Negro equality, but we have not found the place where this equality and these rights exist, or the Negroes who enjoy them. So they knew that that was a ploy. They knew that that was a raw deal. And they also knew they're not Negro people. They were still indigenous people. And they said, we claim that while one drop of Indian blood remains in our veins, we are entitled to the rights and privileges guaranteed by your ancestors to ours by solemn treaty, which without a breach of faith you cannot violate. We did not go to the white man, but the white man came to us. When we were powerful and he was weak, he claimed our protection and we extended it. We are now weak, and our grasping neighbors of a grasping race are seeking the remaining remnant of our inheritance and will not give over while an inch of our territory remains to us, and until the members of our tribe are beneath the soil or are scattered to the winds of heaven. We deny your right to take from us that which never came from you.
Where was that written?
That is in the, I have it here. Do I? No. Oh, I was trying to cut this down from the other presentation where it has it all. And I have the exact place you can find it, but it was the Rhode Island Legislative, it was like 1866. They held conversations at the State House, and there's way more. And it was published, actually, a lot of it was published in the Providence Journal at the time. So there's records of it there as well. But it was really, I mean, that's powerful words right there. And so that's going to move people, right? And it did for a minute. Because the decision after that was that after those hearings were held, they decided, all right, we're not going to let you be a tribe anymore, we'll make you a corporation. Which seems really weird, but that's what Alaskan Native tribes are today. So it's not like it's the first time it's ever been done. This was an idea that's happened before and still happens now. That protected the reservation from sale to outsiders, so they still didn't get that 3,000 acres, which was the whole goal to begin with. So after 14 years, they held meetings and they quickly terminated. I mean, they held no more conversations around it. There was no more interactions with the tribe. They just made that decision to terminate the tribe. And they held an auction. The sale of the reservation was held, and that 3,000 acres was sold. And every man, woman, even babies as young as a year old, received $15 in change for that land. And the only land that wasn't sold was 2 acres around the Narragansett Indian Church, because that was holy, sacred ground. So it's really what has kept us together as a community ever since, because it was the one gathering place that never left. It's where we held our annual August meeting every year, which is the oldest recorded Native gathering in the United States. Just means they made record of it, and it's been on record for 347 years as happening continuously. So of course, you know, we just curled up in a ball and gave up. No, we fought for a good 100 years. We fought, other tribal communities fought. And there were some things that started to change. The Snyder Act of 1924, that created citizenship for Indian people. And so that also gave Native people the right to vote. However, states did not enact that in every state until 1957. So not every Native person in every state had the right to vote until 1957. And even then, because of acts against people of color to keep them from voting, it wasn't protected until the Civil Rights Act. So really, Native people did not get the right to vote until 1964 in every place in America. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 basically said, yeah, we did wrong by detribalizing all of these tribal communities. The Allotment Act was wrong, all of this was wrong, but we don't really know what to do about it yet. So they started to reorganize tribes, some started to get their recognition back, but this wasn't happening for all tribes everywhere. And it really took quite a number of years before they figured out a process by which tribes could apply to have that recognition returned to them. That didn't happen until 1978 with the federal recognition process. So now communities that had been detribalized could apply for recognition, and you had to basically show, it's a really incredibly difficult and long process that requires that you show that even though they detribalized you, took your land, made your practices illegal, many communities had been divided by boarding schools, taking children from your communities, all of that had happened in this 100 years time. But you have to show that you never stopped being a tribe anyway. You never stopped having a tribal government. You never stopped having your tribal ceremonies and community practice. You still had to prove all of that. The Narragansett tribe were able to prove all of that, and a lot of the reasons why was the Narragansett Indian Church, because it was still that place where we could meet. Tribal meetings continuously were held there, even after detribalization, and there's records of all of that. We have leaders like, even unwitting leaders, like Ellison Tarzan Brown, who was a marathon runner, and he was, you know, racing nationally and went to the Olympics in Munich, Germany, representing as a Narragansett person when they're saying we don't exist anymore. They detribalized us. All of that was proof of our remaining as a tribal community. So we won our federal recognition, and it was put in place in 1983. They also created Indian Child Welfare Act, that's called ICWA. That was in 1978 to stop the removal of Native children from our communities. And it is it is being threatened right now. It is in the court systems right now. They are trying to do away with that. People forget history and why these things were put in place. And it's meant to protect these children. The foster care system is not meant to remove children from their families and communities. It's supposed to help them get better and reunite. And yet, even when there are families in the tribal community willing to take them, they still are trying to adopt our children outside of our communities. And this divorces them from their communities, but also their inheritance. Their inheritance and the treaty agreements left to them by the United States government. So this is purposefully being done, and it's under attack again. And those who are fighting it, but they have another agenda. Because at the same time, those very same lawyers who are fighting ICWA are also fighting Native sovereignty in all kinds of other arenas. So there's a bigger issue at stake, and they're using that. And our children are pawns in the middle of this. The Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 gave us protections to be able to practice our traditional religions. This is what allows us to use sacred parts like, what do they call, like raptor feathers, so eagles, hawks, falcons, all of those birds. There's repositories around the country where if one dies, it goes there, and they distribute those parts to Native communities for our ceremonial pieces, our regalias, and other things of that nature. And then there was the Land Claim Settlement Act of 1978. So a lot of things happened in 1978. The Land Claim Settlement Act gave tribes the right to take states to court for that land that was taken from them, including that 3,000 acres that we lost back in 1880. And so we went to court, and it was a long court battle in Charlestown, and it was a very ugly time in our history in the state of Rhode Island. And what was agreed upon in the end, what they settled for was 1,800 acres in the town of Charlestown, so not the full 3,000 acres. And that's what it looks like. Most of it is swamp land. All of the bodies of water are still able to be accessed by other by state and local groups, so we have no true maintenance of any body of water. And we have zero coastal access, none. So for a community whose life and livelihood has been connected to the water for generations, we have no access to the water, which is where we come into the whole reason I came today to talk about water is life. So we're gonna play a little game.
Okay.
You got $25. That's it. For the rest of your life. So with that $25, you have to buy a few things. You have to make a few decisions. It's gonna take care of everything you need, but you gotta stretch that money as far as it will go. So you gotta figure out what's most important to you. What things do you enjoy the most? What matters to you? If you only have $25, what things do you have to have? What things can you go without? What things do you prefer, but maybe it's not worth that if we only have so much? I know this seems really silly, but go with me here. Think about it. So if I got $25, I have 3 boys. Can I live in a 2-bedroom house with 3 boys without losing my mind? Maybe I'm going to splurge a little bit on that one and give ourselves a little more space. How much do we eat? When do we want to eat? How do we want to eat? Some people are like, I will not cook ever. And it doesn't matter. I'd rather have nowhere to live. I'm eating out whenever I want, wherever I want. How much importance does recreation have to you? So when we have only $25 and we have to make some decisions, it makes us get really tough about those decisions we're making. What things do I really not want to have to give up? But I gotta stretch this. I gotta make it work because this is all I have. No more is coming, so I gotta make some really difficult decisions. And I might not always like those choices, but I do what feels the best because I know that's all I've got. Well, what if we thought the same way about water? What if that $25 was going to be all we had in relationship to how we use water? So if I only got $25, and I need to be able to do all of these things, what things are most important? What do I have to have? And what can I go without? I'm hoping everybody is definitely spending some money on showers. But maybe we can settle for a few less showers a week. Maybe some of us can't. I don't know what kind of line of work you're in. When we flush our toilets, do we want to go flush? Do we want to have our toilet, our bidet, feel very clean whenever we want? Or can we go with a water-saving toilet? Something that, has the one side and the other for all our business. How often do we need to do laundry? Do you need a perfectly manicured yard? Is a food garden really important to you? do I have to have a pool? And you'll notice that it even is going to cost to swim in our lakes and streams, because guess what? That's water that we need for other things, and now you're sticking your body in it. So you got to pay a little bit for that. But we start to think, if I only have so much, then I gotta make it stretch. I'm gonna run out, so I have to make some hard decisions that I might not prefer. But this resource is not renewable. Well, neither is our water. Earth has all the water that it has ever had or will ever have. That's it. You're not getting any more. What's here is it. We are drinking the same water that the dinosaurs bathed in, that our ancestors had ceremony with. This is it. This water is just getting recycled over and over again. And there's only so much of it that's actually ingestible. Because of all the water on Earth, 97.2% is ocean water. That is not drinkable. There is about 2.15% that's all in the glaciers that unfortunately are slowly melting. That is concerning. And 0.65% of the water on Earth is our groundwater, our lakes, our river, the soil moisture. It's in the atmosphere. And that's what we have. That's it. That's the only consumable water, is that little tiny percentage. And so when we use water, we think it's endless, because we live in a place where there's lots of water, and we just turn on the faucet and it keeps coming. And we think that that's never going to go away. There is only a little bit of that. And it is cycling over and over again. And when it gets polluted, it stays polluted. And that is now in the cycle. So we have a very little bit of this resource that we have to make last, because we are absolutely dependent upon it for survival. If we lost just 12 to 15% of our body fluid, we would die. You would die from dehydration in just 3 to 4 days. Our bodies need 11 to 15 cups of water every single day. And the younger you are, the more water you need. And it helps everything in our bodies to function. When we don't get enough, everything starts to struggle. Our bones, our lungs, our heart, our eyes, all of that requires water to work properly. So water is literally life. But for Indigenous people, it's also identity. Nahahagansik, that's how we say Narragansett in our language. It means people of the small point. It's talking about those points of land that meet the water. And we arguably, I will say arguably, have inhabited these lands for 30,000 years. At least 20,000 years. And I still say arguably because there are some researchers who say, yeah, but those early inhabitants are not, the Narragansetts are not descended of them. Well, who were they? Where did we come from? In our traditional stories, we were created here. This is where we've always been. We were created from the clay of this earth. And so I go with my people. I don't know where else we came from. All I have ever known has been part of this place. We are an eastern woodland coastal people. This, we already saw this map. Did we already see this map? Maybe. Well, we are in the state of Rhode Island, and you will see most of what was Rhode Island was Narragansett land, and all of the waterways of all of these tribal communities, how connected we are to the waters here. Our whole life and livelihood comes from it. Water are our lifeways, the foods, the minerals, the plant resources. This is a picture of Princess Redwing, one of the founders of the museum, and she is covering our awitu with a particular type of water plant. Anybody know what kind of plant? Say it again. Seaweed? Did someone say seaweed? Not seaweed. I heard it though. Cattails. Those beautiful cattails, one of my favorite plants. And an ingenious use of plants for summer home construction, because it is a water plant. And what it does is when it's dry and you make these mats from it, there's gaps, between them. So when you cover your home with them, there's gaps in it where air can blow through. Do you want gaps in your home when it rains? No. But what water plants do is they suck up the rain. And so all those gaps close up. And it's now waterproof. Then as the sun comes out, it starts to dry and those cracks come back. You now have air blowing through wet reeds into your home. It's like nature's air conditioning. So an ingenious use of plant materials, plant resources here that are gathered from our waterways. They literally house us. The fishing and the clamming that we do, swimming and diving. I don't know if anyone's ever dove for quahogs before. That's big business in our communities and big competition. Who can get the biggest quahog? Can you get down there and get it before it goes deeper into those waters? The traveling and trades that happened, all of those waterways connected us to other tribal communities. And even whaling ventures. We were known traditionally to be whalers and even post-colonial. Many of our community members served on whaling vessels and traveled all over the world. Some really interesting stories and research done by Jason Mancini around Indian whalers. And these traditions still continue today. This is Stan Shears, he's Abenaki, and he was teaching how to make traditional dugout canoes. They still make these machines in our community. Really, Roger Williams talks about these boats. These would go for miles out into the ocean, into the open waters, with skilled sailors because they were very easily rocked and overturned. These waters around Rhode Island are full of them under the ground because it was common for them to tip over and sink under. And Roger Williams talked about Native people swimming back 2 miles or more from those boats when they would tip over. And he was saved and carried on back by one of those Native swimmers when it overturned out in the waters. So we were good swimmers. We spent a lot of time in our waterways. It was home to us. Water is our foodways. It's what feeds us. The shellfish, the mollusks, all of the freshwater and saltwater fish. Things like turtle, whale, seal, beaver, otter, muskrat, those were all food sources for us. And even the things that grow by the water, our beach plums, wild grapes, they don't only have to grow by the water, but we've got some good spots of them around Rhode Island. Rose hips, which also grow everywhere. Roses grow in every landscape all over North America, all different kinds of roses. And all roses give a fruit, rose hips. And all rose hips are edible. They don't all taste good, but they are full of vitamin C. 1 cup of rose hips will give you 900% of the vitamin C your body needs daily. And you can't get too much vitamin C. It goes right through your body, so you can start fresh every day, and it helps you not to get sick. Cattails, water lilies, seaweeds, these are all edible food sources that are coming out of our waterways. And we keep those traditions going today. These children, was a summer camp we did at Tomaquag Museum, and they went down to Ninigret, and using the resources there with some twine that we had brought with us, they made nets and went out into Ninigret and caught blue shell crab, which they did not take home to eat, though they wanted to. But we don't know how clean the waters were and if that was really allowable where we were at that time. We want these next generations to keep these traditions, and unfortunately they're being lost to us for lack of access, because many of the places where our community has been going for generations are now all privately owned. There's no more entryway, and even if you could get to them by boat, which some of our community members started to do, now they're renting the waters. So now you can't even float over there and harvest from those waters. So it's becoming less and less available. They are blocking our entry points, a lot of it because they want you to go to town beaches. They're trying to avoid people parking along in different areas so that you'll go and pay for parking along the beaches. So that means we cannot bring our elders down to these places because they can't get there unless we can drive them in. So it is really cutting off the ability to continue those practices in the way that we have done for generations, even through my age, so that my children and their generation are missing out on so much that generations before them had. We were talking about herring. My family grew up, they call them buckies, smoking buckies, and there we had our fishing camps, the herring moon ceremonies, and our generations never grew up with them because they stopped allowing you to fish for herring in Rhode Island. And so I can't, it's like I have faint memory, but I can't relate any of that in my lifetime. My children have never known that. The only connection we have been with the Wampanoag community, who, through agreements with the state, are still able to fish for herring. And because of that relationship, they are protecting and managing the waters so that the herring are doing better there. Because nature is meant to be interacted with. And the more we interact with it, the more we care for it and nurture it, the better it does. And so it's actually doing better up there than down here where we just say, no, you can't. This is Sherry Cocknett. She's a chef in the Mashpee Wampanoag Nation. She fishes and forages and hunts for her own foods that go into many of her recipes. If you ever get a chance to visit her restaurant, Sly Fox Den 2 in Charlestown, definitely worth a visit. A lot of cultural knowledge around our foodways that come out of there, because these foodways are part of who we are. When you think of the food memories that you have, they're related to your traditions, to your culture, to your family, to those stories and all those events that you grew up with. And it's the same for us. Water is ceremony. We are born from water. Water cleanses us. So in our community, we have what's known as traditional washes, and they can happen at different times of the year. My mother shares her stories, and I always can envision and imagine of her mother taking them down to school, Deep Pond, to break that ice and dip in and wash off in January. That was meant to cleanse you, get rid of any germs and sicknesses that you might carry throughout those months, and build up your stamina to be able to deal with the cold. And that was a tradition that they had. And I found in marrying my husband, who's from Utah, that they had very similar traditions way out there. They give snow baths. They do snow baths out there, where right from birth, the child's first winter, they are taken out into the snow and bathed in the snow, and it's meant to cleanse them and build up their stamina to the cold. And they continue those snow baths annually, even into their adulthood. You go out there, you roll around. My husband did his snow bath right after this. These traditions of washing and cleansing ourselves. We have our wash day that follows our green corn Thanksgiving, where they go down to the ocean, they hold ceremony there, and they bathe in the waters. It's done differently now because of access. You're on public beaches, in public spaces. It's done at sunrise. People are all in your business, and you can't hold a feast there, so they go to Hungry Haven, and they've made that their tradition. So there's adaptations to continue those traditions. The ceremony of sweat lodge, it's sweating, removing from you the water in your body. That is bringing out the bad, the old, the negative, and you're being reborn. And water is brought into that lodge, and it is poured onto the rocks to create that steam that helps you to sweat and do that release. So the water comes out. But after the water comes out, you then, when you leave the sweat lodge, it's like being reborn, fresh and new. And the first thing that you do is bathe. You would go back into water to replenish all of that. Our communities traditionally did that by the ocean ways, because we would go back into that salt water and bathe in that salt water, bringing the salt into our bodies again and washing off and rejuvenating in that way. In mountain communities, they go into those freezing cold streams that, I can't even imagine. But we continue those traditions today. Our quahogs that are a food source. Make the best chowder you've ever had. Don't use sea clams. Use quahogs, because that's where all of your flavor is coming from. Don't wash them. That washes away all your flavor. You need that, so you might get a little bit of grit, but you will have such a tastier chowder that way. And then when it's done, you have that beautiful shell, and from that beautiful shell, we make our traditional wampum. Wampum pea, they are beads made from the shells of whelks and quahogs. Wampum actually refers to the word wampi, which means white. They were talking about white shell beads. Quahog is the purple bead. And the way these two were laid together told a story. And they recorded our history, they recorded things that were happening, things of celebration, things of sorrow. But they created records, and they were gifted throughout our community. You earned the right to this gift. And it was believed that when you had wampum, you couldn't lie. So you would tell the truth when you wore it. You had to be worthy of it. So it was often given to messengers when they would go from one village to another, because if you were entrusted with wampum as you carried that message, they knew you were telling the truth. So it was highly regarded in our communities. It was traded extensively, which is kind of where Europeans saw it as being money because of that exchange. But it was a resource that was sacred to many nations. The Haudenosaunee in New York, they have beautiful traditions around wampum. They are not a coastal community that had access to this resource. Where do you think they're getting it all from? So this was a cultural sharing of these resources that were happening from the coast inward. And this is just some beautiful stuff. Winona LaDuke was recently here at the university for the honors colloquium. She's an activist, an economist, writer from the White Earth Chippewa, and she said, "Water is life. We are the people who live by the water, pray by these waters, travel by these waters, eat and drink from these waters. We are related to those who live in the water. To poison the waters is to show disrespect for creation. To honor and protect the waters is our responsibility as people of the land." If we were to think of water as being a spirit in and of itself, for us, the spirit of the ocean, Pompagussit, it is a being. And when you think of it as a being, you treat it differently, because you don't disrespect some other being, another life force. So you would interact with it different, you would honor it differently. And for those who are doing the work of protecting our waters, they have come up with the term water protector. And so you may hear that now. Water protectors are doing the active work of activism to protect our waterways. And it has been an extensive movement throughout Native communities, because a lot of times when waterways are threatened, they are threatened in the most impoverished communities first. Think of Flint, Michigan. And there was no desire and no movement, even still, to clean up their waters, because they are seen as less important, because they are more impoverished. And it's the same for Native communities whose waterways are threatened by pipelines that have been going across, mining projects. The Navajo have not had clean drinking water for generations. They are also suffering from drought and not having access to water. The Dakota Access Pipeline that was recent, I think everything is recent. COVID has thrown things out of whack. It's been a little bit. But it was, what is the name? Standing Rock. Community that were trying to stop this pipeline from going off across their waterway, because we know pipelines break, and this was their drinking water, and if it breaks, it was going to affect the water that all of them drank. And they were met with serious violence when they were protesting that. And guess what happened? The pipeline was going anyway, and it broke and polluted their water, just like they feared it would. That was an ongoing battle. They didn't necessarily win that battle. In fact, they lost that, even though it became international movement. And internationally, everybody heard about it, and here in the States, it wasn't on any major news channel. They really squelched that movement that was huge everywhere, but in the States where they did not want you to hear about it. So unless you were following alternate news sources that were talking about it, you barely heard about it here in the States. This brought people from all over the world in response to try to protect those waterways. They were not successful, and the U.S. military was brought in to remove people. People were injured with rubber bullets, and the project started to go forward. It actually stopped for another reason. It's halted now, it's not happening, but it could still pick up again at some point in time depending on who's in office. So it's not an end to that battle. So these movements to protect waterways from pipelines, pollution, overfishing, from climate change, which are increasing the acidity of ocean waters, have rising sea levels, and there are tribal communities whose homes are threatened as the sea levels rise, and we don't know where they're going to go when their lands are flooded. There's warming waters. For anybody who's a fisherman here, you'll notice there's new things in our water, and things that used to be here aren't anymore. Everything's moving northward. Major storms that are bringing pollutants, invasive species that are here in our areas now, overdevelopment all around our waterways, the erosion around our waterways that kills so many important plants. These are the things that water protectors are fighting to preserve. And so how can we protect and preserve our waterways? There are some little simple things that we can do. It doesn't have to be a huge deal. It really just means being mindful, conserving the water that you're using. Think of that $25 that's gotta last you the rest of your life, and make some different decisions, because that's the only water you're ever going to have. Disposing of harmful materials properly, looking into how those things should be gotten rid of, holding other places accountable to that. You can volunteer with groups that are doing the work of stewarding our waters, doing cleanups. The more you stay informed about these issues and inform others, that's one of the most helpful things that you can do, because we just don't think about it. Who's thinking about water constantly every day? Maybe some of us, the conservationists in the room, those who work in these places, but for most people, they're not. Most people are not. And so we need to be thinking about these things and reminding others that this is important if we want to do that work. And if you want to learn more about protecting our waterways, there's some really great books out there. One I recommend by Winona LaDuke, To Be a Water Protector, The Rise of the Wendigo Slayers. That's a wonderful book about, it kind of takes the analogy of the Wendigo, which kind of like a, I know some people have portrayed it like a vampire, others like a werewolf. It's a very dark creature that basically wants bad things and sucks all the good out of everything. And they use that analogy to what's happening to our waters, and the threat against our waters and what we can do to protect that water. There's a book written by a child called Young Water Protectors. It's by Aslan Tudor. He was a young boy who was out at the Dakota Access Pipelines and wrote about his experience out there. So it's a really cool book to read about that movement from a child's perspective who had to see that violence firsthand. We Are Water Protectors is a children's book by Carol Lindstrom, but it's beautiful. It's also one of the Read Across Rhode Island books. This year, they chose books by Indigenous authors, and the book was Firekeeper's Daughter, but they had companion books for every age group, and the children's book was We Are Water Protectors. If you haven't read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, you must. It's absolutely beautiful, it's inspiring, it feeds the soul, and get it on audiobook, because she reads it to you in her own voice, and her voice is like therapy. It's soothing, it's beautiful to listen to, you will love it. There's some websites that you can check out with more resources around water protection and these movements. And these were some videos that I had that weren't watching, but there's links to them. So if anybody wants these resources, send me an email. If you grab one of our pamphlets, the email address on here is mine, so I get everybody's mail. So forgive me if I don't get back to you, because all the mail comes through me. I will get back to you, and I can send these resources to you. And I just will end with this last quote by Ine Gay, who's another advocate and activist. He said, "Water is not only a human and indigenous right, it is a sacred and powerful being. Our delegation is concerned that water is quickly becoming the next great commodity. But amidst the rampant corporate buy-up of water resources, there's a growing movement for the protection of water as a basic human right. If it gets to the point where water becomes so limited, who do you think is going to get that resource? Won't be us. So that's even more of a reason to make sure we protect this resource. And if you want to learn more, you can check us out at tomaquagmuseum.org. We have lots of other resources there, and welcome you to check out our events and come visit us. We have a lot of things going on. We'll be back on campus December 3rd, the first Saturday in December, for our Nakomo, our giveaway. We're doing it in collaboration with the Native Student Organization here, so we'll be right in the Multicultural Center. We would love to have you all come and join us. Free event. It's 12 to 4 that day. And it should be a lot of fun, so we hope that you come and see us then.
It's our great church fair.
Oh, goodness. Maybe we can slide through.
Yeah, but it goes till 4, so.
It goes to 12 to 4. We'll be there, and if you can make it, we'd love to see you there. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, I wonder if you could mention a little bit about something that was stopped from happening. There was a group in Burrillville that was going to come down and drain. Was it?
Yeah. So
House Pond?
that was part of the Burrillville Power Plant project. They were looking to build a new power plant in Burrillville. And the idea was to get water to fund that, it requires a lot of water. And so they were looking for a water resource and had approached some individuals at the tribe to see if it would be possible to take water from off our reservation there, because our tribe sits on top of a natural aquifer. So they wanted to take that water up out of the ground. They would drive it from there all the way up to Browerville. So imagine that carbon footprint. And so they had kind of put that forward like it was a done deal with the tribal community. And the tribal community was like, no, we've never even heard of this. This never came before a vote. And so everyone in the tribal community, as soon as they got wind of it, they were like, absolutely not. And we said to our tribal leaders, no, we want no part of that deal whatsoever. We participated in the fight to stop the Burrillville Power Plant project. We spoke up and came and spoke up at many of the town meetings for it. And it did end up getting, what's the word? Not happening.
It was defeated, right?
It was defeated.
Yeah.
It was defeated.
People that chained themselves to the.
Oh, the people of Burrillville were not going to let this happen, over their dead bodies for sure. But they also had the support of the tribal community who came out and said, absolutely not, we're not selling you our water, that's not going to happen. And we don't agree with this power plant project either, for a myriad of reasons. So that was what happened there. And it shows what we can do when we come together as communities to talk about these issues and have those conversations, because they were leveraging conversations they had had with the tribe as if it was a done deal to get that project to move forward. So when we have conversations and start to work together, we're really coming from the same place, and we can get work done that way.
So how are decisions made does the tribal council seek consensus from, I mean, how does?
Yeah, so we do. We have our chief and we have our tribal council. So the chief and the tribal administration, they're people that work in the office every day running all of the different departments. And the chief makes decisions on behalf of the business running of a tribal community. But when those kind of bigger issues come, they go before the tribal council, which are an elected body of people. And so they have to hear all the sides of it. They may deliberate whether or not it's something that they think is in our best interest. If it gets to the point where they say, yeah, we think this is something we're interested in, or the body should know about this, they bring it to our body meetings. So that is a monthly meeting that's held with the tribal community where all of those issues are brought up. We hold votes of whether or not we're going to go ahead with any of these things. So the body has to agree to those kind of projects. The tribe cannot just act alone, separate from the community, especially on big things that are taken from all, resources that belong to all of us. So it hadn't even gotten to that point yet. So they were kind of leveraging just what was early conversations as if it was a done deal. Yeah.
Is there a risk that the Supreme Court is going to try to do away with tribal sovereignty?
Yes, that is very real. That is a fear, because all of these cases that are being brought forth right now around issues of putting land into federal trust, it was Judge Clarence Thomas who ruled, I don't remember years, but he ruled against our tribal community years ago that land that the tribe had received as a part of, after the land claim settlement, that that the way that it was written, and it really came down to the word now, which is ridiculous. I'm sorry, if I had the actual language, you could see how stupid it was. But that the word now meant that tribes, not just, and this affects more than just our tribes, it can get used against other tribes too, that tribes after the federal, after the Reorganization Act of 1934, that those lands in federal trust now meant as of 1934. So anything after 1934 couldn't be put into federal trust and therefore would not have the same protections in the way as those lands, basically reservation tribes, that land was already established up until 1934. So that's not just us, that's a lot of tribal communities that puts into jeopardy. It's something that the Wampanoag just recently dealt with when they got their federal recognition and were looking to put their already reservation land, because they were a state recognized tribe, they already had that reservation for generations, but they were looking to put it into federal trust, and that's in the courts. It's not over. It's still going whether or not they'll be able to put their land into federal trust. When it's in federal trust, it becomes sovereign land. It's recognized as governable by the tribe with our own laws. That even though it's sovereign, the U.S. federal government is still like Big Brother. It's not like it's 100% freedom. But now, because there's an attack on federal trust land, there's an attack on ICWA, but that's really aimed at the sovereignty of tribes. And there's attacks on, I can't remember now. There's a number of cases that are coming up in front of this, and if it makes it to this Supreme Court, we don't know how they will fare in a very conservative Supreme Court. And some of those have already made it very clear that they are not looking to protect the sovereignty of tribal nations. So,
to protect anybody.
no, really. So we really don't know what's going to happen. These are very real issues that are affecting our communities, and everything is just kind of, poised on the precipice of this, of these decisions that we don't know how it's going to turn out.
Yeah, it can depend on the whoever's president at the time, and that can change. I was just hearing an article by Ibram X. Kendi. He wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he interviewed a native person, I don't even know which tribe it was, about the national parks. And there was the national parks called Bears Ears, and Obama extended that, but then when Trump came on, they took it back.
Yeah.
And so the idea was to, if we do any kind of reparations, to give back the national parks to native, to make the national parks native land. I thought that, because then it would not be affected by these changes.
So that's
wonderful idea.
that's part of the land back movement. There's an actual movement. There's a movement called Land Back,
Yeah.
and that's part of that movement
Yeah,
is to return public lands
Okay.
back to tribal communities. The thing about that too is that one of the things also to keep in mind is there's a lot of stereotypes around Native people being very close to land, protectors of the land. Yes, we care about those things, but we also have to survive in the world as it is now. And what we are asking for too as tribal nations is that sovereignty be actual sovereignty, to be able to make decisions with what we do with our land and how we do those things, and not have that presided over by the federal government, what we can and cannot do. Right now we have lands, some tribes have lands, and they have no right to say, no, we don't want the minerals mined on our lands. The government is doing that. They have no rights to stop that at all. They're taking it. There are other tribes. My husband's tribe has oil on his land. They are taking the oil, and they also govern who you can do business with. So that way you can't negotiate for better rates for your natural resources. And they're being paid at rates that are like 30 years old. So they're being way underpaid for this natural resource on their lands that they have no control. You're taking it regardless, but now you're not even paying us for it. So that's where, if you actually return true sovereignty to tribal communities, they can negotiate them things for themselves in their own way. It can build support for their tribes. They might stop it altogether and choose not to do that. That's what sovereignty is, being able to make those decisions. So that's part of that land back movement too, to be able to really have sovereignty.
I have a million questions, but
That's
I
okay.
think I'll try one. To be recognized internationally as a sovereign nation, would that put not the pressure, but the spotlight on how the United States is
Like
recognizing
talking about
the
the
US?
UN.
Yeah,
having
like
the
right
UN
now with
recognize
the
us.
climate and all, like to be there and say, we're a sovereign nation, that you really have a reason to be recognized as a sovereign nation
Yeah.
internationally. Because there's indigenous people all over the world.
And
in
a
the
lot
same
of them
position you're
petitioning
in.
for that. It's
Okay,
not necessarily successful.
right.
So that is a thing. It is, there are nations who have tried it before. There are nations who have been in conversation around that. And so it has not been successfully done yet to have indigenous people recognized by the UN as a sovereign nation. They have stepped in kind of like, in support of certain indigenous groups to protect them, their human rights,
it's
but
always
not
on
to
their
recognize
terms.
them as a nation, as a part of the UN.
That's right.
That hasn't happened yet. So it is an idea. People have tried it, as being talked about. It is maybe something that more people should push for. I don't know if they feel they're actually going to get anywhere with that, but
Can you sign a petition? Like, would that put any kind of weight on it?
I know there's petitions like that out there for different communities. I mean, doesn't hurt to try
Who
things,
would organize
but I just
that?
I've yet to see it be successful for anyone else yet. So,
Okay.
but that is an idea for sure.
How are things going with the new museum?
Yeah, very good thus far. It's a hugely big undertaking. It's very overwhelming for me. But Loren spearheads that movement, and I pick up the slack around the office, and that's why I do all of these programs now in her place that she used to do. But from what she relays to me and the parts that I have been a part of, we are on track to break ground in spring of next year. Spring of 23. And then if all goes well, because that's a big process, the hope would be to have it built by the end of next year. And the plan with the interior design is scheduled to be in that same time period, and the new exhibit design, they think they'll be done ready to show by spring of 2024. So possibly summer of 2024 might be our grand opening. But we need many prayers for that and more donations. So hopefully all of that comes to fruition and we'll stay on track. But right now we're doing well. I know for sure it's a big project. The ultimate goal is 4 buildings. The first phase is to build the first 3. So this movement is all towards those first 3 buildings. If push comes to shove, we might not be able to build all 3, but something's going up for sure. We definitely have enough money for at least 1, possibly 2 of those buildings now. So it's happening.
What will become of the current space?
So the current space we rent. It's not owned by the museum. We rent that space. It's owned by Dawn Dove. And we will continue to rent it for a while because that's where our archives will remain until we get the 4th building built, because that's the one that's really, but we feel that one's going to be the easiest to get federal dollars to support building once the other is in place, because there's many more grants to support that, but we can't get them until we have the establishment where it needs to be, so that they'll give us that. So that's going to take a little bit longer. We're looking at almost like a 8 to 10 year goal line of getting that 4th building in. So we'll still be using that for a time for storage and archives and things until we get that 4th building built.
So do many know the language, the native tongue? Or is there, a goal for people to be learning it?
So our Narragansett language is no longer fluently spoken. It hasn't been fluently spoken since the early 1800s. So what we have left are a lot of words and phrases. There's the documentation from Roger Williams, but there's also the Natick Dictionary that is a compilation of indigenous languages from the Algonquin family, including Narragansett language. So because it isn't fluently spoken anymore, we do have what is the encouraging model of what the Wampanoag have done. Mashpee Wampanoag, under the leadership of Jessie Dobaird, she has really rebuilt the language from what they had and incorporating their sister languages of other Algonquin communities to kind of rebuild and recreate a fluently spoken language again. And they now have a language revitalization school where the children are growing up fully immersed in the language, so they are becoming fluent speakers. And it's awesome to see that reclamation practice taking that back. It's a huge project and a huge undertaking. Our language is not exactly the same as Mashpee's. We have similarities, but it's not the same. But it shows us that a project like that could be done for our community as well. But it's huge. You have to wait for that one gifted person that's like, that's what I want to do. And I'm a linguist and I can figure out all that stuff. So in our community, we try to use as much language as we can as often as possible. And keeping what we do have and sharing that between communities. And we have some really vibrant young people pushing for that. One of our educators, Lindsay Montanari, is really big on that. And she spent her own free time going around to tribal families, teaching them strategies and games to implement language in their everyday life. So they're like, if we just start using what we have as often as we can try to slowly bring that back. So that is happening in our community, but on a small scale. And language projects are are really taking off for lots of tribal communities all over this country, because as our elders go, so does the fluent spoken language. And even those elders that are fluent speaking, because there's so little people to communicate with, they are losing it. So all the projects to try to save what you can is really important.
I mean,
I was just gonna say, we have gone out to the Navajo Nation for over 10 years. We've gone there in the summer to help with from the Episcopal Church. And they have now, a lot of the elders have died during COVID, but they have now people in school, kids learning the Navajo language. They're really getting back to that.
Yeah, a lot of places are trying to implement projects like that. There's federal dollars that are supporting projects like that. But it's a huge undertaking. Native languages can be really difficult, which is why 26 different native languages were used in code talking by the U.S. military. Not just Navajo, there were 26 different languages used, because they are really difficult languages. And with any language, if you're not speaking and using it daily, you will lose that. So,
And they were never written down until the
and a lot of them were never written down. And because they weren't written languages, it's hard to, there's a whole process of figuring out how do we write it down in a way that conveys the sounds, because some of these sounds, you don't see them in other places. And as a language speaker, developmentally, they say if you don't learn to make certain sounds by the time you're 8 years old, you'll never be able to make those sounds. So can you even really pronounce things the way they're meant to be pronounced as you're relearning? There's all of those different factors. But as Debbie Downer as that sounds, we're still trying, and people are still doing that work to try to preserve it. I think that's important, because language conveys so much more than just speaking. And I mean, they have meaning behind these words when you break down the parts of the words and what they mean. The Ojibwe have done really great work around teaching the meaning behind the language. There's a linguist, James Vukolich, who's Ojibwe. If you're ever on social media, he has an Ojibwe word of the day.
He's great.
Yeah, he's great. He is great because he gives so much information and knowledge behind the meanings behind these words, and all the parts that make up the word. And it's incredible how much you can learn from language, and how much is lost when you lose that language too.
Language is always evolving.
They do evolve. 'Cause my mother-in-law is a fluent Ute speaker, and they've got words for elephant, for monkey, for orange, for as they became, as you met and knew new things, they created words for them, and it continued to evolve. And still does to this day when you have to come up with new words for things. Language keepers are trying to find new ways of saying modern words around computers and things that we don't, didn't have. So language does evolve. I think that's really cool. Yeah.
We watched the short video about the stonework that the Narragansett have done, and I found myself really longing to know so much more about that and to see more of it. And I wonder, I just, two questions. One is I wonder how much of it is being documented, because I get this sense that there's still so much history that's yet to be known.
Mm-hmm.
Is that?
Yeah, there was that documentary, Stories in Stone, was a really nice one that kind of started to do that work. I think that's some research someone should undertake, because we have a long history of stonemasonry. Native people have always had a relationship with stone. We worked with stone. We live in a very stony area, so it makes sense to utilize that resource. So because we already had that relationship and knowledge around working with stone, during that colonial period, indentured servitude, much of our community members were taught to become stonemasons and build European-style buildings here, and they became masters at it, particularly at wet stonemasonry, which I don't even really know what that means. It was a particular type of stonemasonry that I guess was very specially skilled, and they traveled all around the eastern seaboard, doing many of these stone buildings. Narragansett stonemasons in places like Maryland and Virginia. So somebody's got to document all of that. That's a cool history, if they could really do that research and bring that whole story together. But it's literally been the line of work that supported our families for generations. We have tons of native stonemasons in our community now, and it's one of those things that aren't dying off generationally. These kids are taking it the next generation and keeping it going. All of the young cousins that I grew up babysitting are now stonemasons, and they're out there doing that work. So it's continuing. What I think is really beautiful about the community is we are artists. We have so many artists in our community. So they have turned stonework into an art form. And Narragansett stonemasonry is beautiful, and they create pictures in stone and artistry, and each family is different, and they know their stuff. They can go and be like, oh, that's Hiawatha's work, or that's Ted Brown, and like they know just by looking at the work who's done that work. My mother's father was a stonemason, had 6 sons. All of those sons did stonemasonry. Some of them started and continued business. All of their children do, and now all of their grandchildren. It's just continuing. So we just, it's a beautiful tradition in our community. And we don't have any stonemasonry in our house. So I'm feeling some kind of way that they haven't done it for us yet. But no, it's a lot of work. And it's what's fed our families for years and still does. Yeah.
I just want to say, I work in Peacedale, and Beth was saying, could we see examples of it? And you mentioned that, of course, native stonemasons were employed to make buildings in, say, European vision. The village of Peacedale is built in granite that was quarried locally, and we have documentation that, native families were hired to build all those buildings, and they still stand. And every time I look at it, it's a testament to the quality of the work, because they're right there and they're going to be there for a long time.
I love that. I think what's lacking is any kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like signage, acknowledgement, so that when you're in places you can see that and know. There's little bits, because there's like that great big watering trough thing outside of the library there, and that has some words around it. It's really empowering to see your contribution to a place, to see your community acknowledged in its history and continuance. So I think it would be really cool if we put more of that history out there for people to see, for our own children and grandchildren to reconnect to, so that they can see, oh, your ancestors did that, and they make that connection between those that did it a long time ago and those still doing it today. I think that would be amazing, because there's some things that we don't know, and there's some things that we do know. Like my grandfather, he knows his very first stone wall that he ever did that he's totally embarrassed by. I don't think he wants his name on that. He was so embarrassed by it, but it was the very first, but it looks great to us. We're proud of it.
The stone path outside the kitchen was done by an indigenous stonemason.
Was it really? See, and I think that's so cool. It would be neat to see these things acknowledged in some way.
So I'm hearing another project.
Yeah, right?
But I'm thinking about.
We got several now.
The process of land acknowledgement, which is now, I go to many groups, and that is how we start. And so, in a way, this is another kind of acknowledgement, like a continuation of that. And, yeah.
I think
it's so promising.
like Loren always says, there is no U.S. history without Indigenous history. And it's meant to remind us that whatever you're learning about, there is an Indigenous footprint there too. What perspectives are you not hearing? What is missing from that story? And when I think of places around Rhode Island, where we see plaques and labels for everybody else, all the people who had the money. But what about the people who did the work? What about the people who left their marks here too? I think we could expand on that.
Are the local historical societies at all receptive?
I don't know that anyone's ever really proposed the idea. That's a good project, like you said. I think it would be incredible to be able to do something like that. So I think, maybe people are receptive to an idea like that.
What a great doctoral dissertation.
Yes, can we get the students to do the legwork, and we'll support.
You never know. I have a friend who's very active in the Lower Sharon, and I know they've never thought about being Sharon.
Yeah.
Sharon has, and certainly there's input.
And things are changing like that everywhere.
You just need to be reminded.
It's something that didn't come to mind that could be a potential project. We see that happening in museums all over our region, that the stories that have forever been ignored are finally starting to get told. It's not just about who owned the property, but who worked there, who was sold in and out of there. All of those other people that left their mark in those places, and they're starting to tell them now. So I think we just jump on that bandwagon and give them yet another job and project to do. But I think that could be a really great one.
Let me throw out another idea, and that would be, a book would be fabulous, but you find a photographer who has a passion for the idea, and in the new museum, that could be one of your first shows.
That would be really great. We did have a researcher he was researching all the different stone walls around.
Yeah, somebody knows.
You know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, where's Thomas?
And so if he's interested in that, maybe he'd be interested in stonemasonry next.
Yeah, this fellow in North Stonington
Yeah, and he.
wandered through miles and miles of woods, discovering all of these stone installations that obviously had been done by indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
Some of which may have had a practical value, others they were indicative of some kind of either a ceremony or yeah.
They didn't know often what it really.
Yeah, they didn't know, but they're very cool.
Yeah.
That's the stuff. I forgot his first name.
So Carolyn, you have a question?
A couple things came in my name around the history. I know a man that worked in Rainbow Orchard, but Mark Archibald.
Oh, I know that name for some reason.
He had a history that he did of the area, the South Kingstown, Wakefield, and he now has Alzheimer's. So I'm not.
Did he write it up?
I don't know.
I know
sure
that
he
name
did something.
from somewhere.
Yeah.
I know I've seen it, and I'm gonna have to ask back at the office, because I believe that he has been connected with the community before. And so some of what he has done is probably out there, because
I can get it,
that name is very familiar to me.
I'll find out where, I work in the company. So,
Okay,
maybe I can help track that down.
yeah.
On a different tangent, not historical, I was wondering if groups like the Rhode Island Nature Conservancy, if they could do any water protection kind of project that the tribal council wants to get done. I don't know if you work with groups like that at all.
We have the different, I know we've been doing, I don't think they were involved in it. We have the Namas Fish Project that was being done with the University of Rhode Island, and some other groups that were really studying our freshwater fish, because, in Rhode Island, if you're eating freshwater fish, you should not be. It's just not clean anywhere, and they were really researching around our relationship with freshwater fish, both historically and now. in efforts to try to do the work of cleaning up and protecting those fresh waterways. So that's a project that's been, it's not over, it's ongoing, with the university and our natural resource department. And Tomaquag Museum has been a part of that as well. So we did a lot of community interviews, gathering stories. That was fun. Those stories got great because they were fishing stories, but next thing you know, they were hunting stories, and then that was a good time, collecting those stories. The conservation groups, we do have some relationship with them. I think there's different ways of how we look at conservation. We talk about Western views of conservation is really around protecting nature from interaction, whereas indigenous conservation is around protecting it for interaction. It's the relationships we're trying to preserve. And really, it's having that relationship and building a love for it, a need for it, that makes you want to protect it all the more. So we may have some fundamental views on how those things should be done, because we want to be able to harvest things and use things and interact with things. And that's not the way that conservation groups really are working to do things. But there's conversations around that happening.
Where are they happening, the conversations?
So, well, I serve on my town's conservation commission. So of course I'm bringing it up, Charlestown. And so we've talked about that there. I have been in meetings with, what's that group? Can I ever remember a name? Is it Nature Conservancy?
Nature Conservancy.
There's them, but there's another group too that's not coming to me.
Is it like Save the Bay or?
Nope, something with the
I know the
C.
contact person from the Nature Conservancy from the state government, Tim Mooney.
Oh, I know that
Tim's
name.
been doing this for many years, and I just actually spent some time with him, and he and I were talking about the exact same thing.
Yeah, the conversations are happening. I've been in rooms where they're talking about it.
Definitely not American,
Yeah.
but he said what it really matters to me is that we make the connections between the tribal view of how culture interacts with nature and the conservancy areas that are in place, including Carter Preserve right here. And he was very sweet. I just met him last week, very nice about it. He just feels very strongly that that's the direction we need to go in.
I think so, and not even just for indigenous communities. I
Right.
feel like all people
Everybody.
need to be able to start interacting and learning and engaging. There's actually a farm, fairly new, it's called Ocean Hour Farm over in Newport. They're doing some really interesting research around, they're trying to see through this farm if, because of the way the water runs off into their area, if they can, through their farming practices, clean the water before it goes out into the bay. And they got money for this, so they can do all of that, and they don't have to make any money off their farm. So it's really research-based, but they reached out to our community specifically to start having conversations about what should we be planting here, what belongs here, and what do you want access to? Because we can plant it, and then you can have access to it. And that's exciting to have a project like that.
It's exciting, but the kind of, when you were talking about how you, as a Native person, had been closed off the access to, like, you can't go to the beach,
Mhm.
you're not allowed to go to the, so what, it's almost like going to the boarding schools, or like you've been removed bit by bit by bit from just all that wisdom. And if somebody comes to you and says, so what do you think we should do now? It's like, you're at a disadvantage
Well,
that we,
Some stuff we have lost, some stuff we still have. There's still a lot of knowledge around land and plant uses in our community. We have people who are very knowledgeable in that area that I have had the benefit of learning from, so I'm still learning and continuing to grow in that. But I do know what I want to be able to have access to. Things that we used to be able to have access to, things that we have limited access to. We used to go pick beach plums in Narragansett Beach when they were on the cliffside. And now it's all eroded. You can't get to them without adding to the erosion there. So we can't go there anymore to harvest. So that was one of the first things I told them, plant some beach plums, because now we'll have a new place to come and get them. The shagbark hickory, none of that grows on our reservation. It's in different parts of the state. We don't have it where we're at. If you're looking to plant nut trees, consider shagbark hickory. Of course, it might not be ready in my generation, but we're not doing this for my generation. We're doing this for generations from now. And so if we have enough knowledge that we can record and teach from, they'll have that then when it's ready, and they now have a place to go and use it. So I think the work is being done now to preserve the knowledge we still have, re-engage with knowledge that was lost, because some of our relative tribes still have that knowledge and can help us bring that back. But where can we do it? Where do we have access to it? So that's the big issue. And so having a place like Ocean Hour Farm says, we want to give you access. We want you to have use. We want you to be able to come on freely and feel comfortable here and be able to harvest here. That's huge.
Yeah.
So we need more of that.
And so much more is gained through collaboration.
Very much so.
And then, just listening to your story, it was all about cutting you off from being able to collaborate. And now it really would be able to at least recognize that and then be able to collaborate.
I think what's awesome is like their farm, they asked what we wanted. What a lot of times happens is people come to you with what they want to do. And so you're trying to fit into their models and their desires, and it's like, well, that's not what we need. That's not what we want.
Right.
That's not what would help us. So being able to lead efforts and have things done in the way that's best gonna benefit your community, that's where real collaboration comes from. That you didn't already come with this plan all designed and you just want me to fit into it. So I think projects like this are exciting. I think it could be a really good model for going forward for other organizations to adopt. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm not a native person, but I want more access to the shore. And I know that the state of Rhode Island in its constitution is supposed to guarantee that for all of the residents. And there is a group that has been more active in seeking legislation that would define and protect people like me. And I wondered if there was, are there people in the tribes who are interested in, maybe they already are, I'm not formally aligned in that group, I just support their efforts, some of them. And I wondered about that as another potential partnership. I'm trying to give you one more thing to do.
No, that's
But
okay.
it's something that's already happening, and there are people, and maybe we don't all have the same respectful approach to it, so there can be a fear of how people are going to use it, but we can work on that part. But I just wondered about trying to...
I know there are some in our community who have been kind of pushing those efforts, and in some really interesting ways. I heard there are some, certain people who were demanding access at Charlestown Beach this year and getting it, because they said, this is our community, we should have access, and they demanded it and got it. So sometimes it's challenging those systems that are in place. I know that, in Charleston they've been working around access, and getting blocked at every turn of all the ideas that they come up with.
Every coastal town.
Yeah, there's one thing after another. That's, you got to do all these things. It's going to cost you $50,000 for you to be able to do, to open that up and do it there. So of course, where's that money coming from? And that shuts that down. And
Joe Smith built his mansion, and
right.
he has rights.
They have everything.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're lacking, is that it's not just our community, but it is everybody. That should be working together to demand access for everybody. Water is a basic human right, and our relationship to these resources and access to enjoy should just be available to everybody. And it's gotten out of control, the privatization of everything here. So everything. It's very frustrating. It's not just frustrating for us. We know it's frustrating for others, and that's where.
Always fighting for access.
Yeah.
So
They get that little corner of Narragansett Beach. Stay on that line.
Yeah, they won that one.
one last quick question, and then we need to let you go home.
Okay.
It's getting late. You mentioned preserving the traditions, and I know they're preserved orally, but is there documentation now that's happening?
There is and has been efforts towards that for quite a while now. Princess Redwing really led those efforts when she started the Narragansett Dawn. That was a real big undertaking in the 1930s to start to make physical record of our stories and our language and recipes and memories, and even just what we're thinking today. And so that was really the effort to start beginning to make documentation of it. There are tape recordings that the museum has in its repositories for generations, and we just keep trying to add to that as much as we can. In writing, in recordings, every little bit. And it's huge. Our archives is enormous, and it's such a huge project for someone to go through everything and figure out everything that we've had, because they didn't have computers when they first started the museum, and they were collecting all of this, so it's all in files. So literally we've had projects again and again, but like they're just touching a piece, so we're always uncovering something new that we're like, oh my gosh, we didn't know we had this. So it's exciting work. It's a lot of work to start making that all available is what we're hoping to do. The more you go through each bit of that, we'll have, we found way more things than we ever knew. We found records from a woman who was a famous musician and traveled all over Europe, Hote Casella. And we had all her records, and we're like, who even is this? And we found out her whole story in our collections of, she performed at some of the biggest places in the world, and she had turned native music into opera to perform at all these venues and introduce the world to native music. And she was huge in her time and kind of forgotten to history, and we have all these records of her.
That's another good project for you.
It's another project.
Yeah.
Our archivist has done some of the research, and now it's the money to get all of those records preserved and get those recordings off so that they're so that we have all of that. But like her story came back out of just
After they have her singing.
digging through stuff. It's
Sing
actually
records,
her
you mean,
singing
yeah,
in records. Yeah.
Of her voice.
Yep.
Very cool.
Yeah, it is really cool. So we found like neat things like that you don't even know is in there, and we only have it because she was a friend of Princess Redwing. Our museum is really interesting because where it was founded in 1958, it started before federal recognition for the Narragansett tribe. So at the time that they were preserving and doing this history, it was part of the resistance to detribalization.
Wow.
That you're saying we're not here, yeah we are. We're gonna start our own museum and just teach us how here we are and share that history with you. So we have a myriad of things in that collection. And some of it has nothing to do with us because we also have the works of Eva Butler, who is the other founder of the museum, and she was an anthropologist. She traveled all over North and South America. We've got some of that in there. So we're finding new things all the time as we go through everything that's in there.
Hacking's going to be quite the chore.
Yeah.
Our archivist and collections manager have been working on that. We have no room is the problem. Literally our collection room is like floor to ceiling, and you're just kind of like walking through it like this, and they're trying to clear a space to work in. But the archives is really the thing. We have hundreds of thousands of cultural material in that archives, and we just haven't even touched the surface of everything that's in there. And so it's a big job, but it's exciting when you find something really cool and really interesting. So there's things that are there, and we're adding to it. I think the goal is let's keep adding to it, because what is current now is going to be history later, so we need to keep recording everything that's happening still.
We just read through with my book club, The Night Watchman
Oh,
by
okay.
Louise Erdrich.
I haven't read that yet,
It
but
was amazing.
was it
And
really
it's
good?
about the 1953 termination bill that they tried to put
Okay.
through.
yeah.
And there was the Turtle Clan, and it was so amazing, because as I was reading, I kept Googling everything, so I was reading and learning everything, and it was all,
She's an excellent author.
she's
Her books
such a
are
good
really
writer.
good. She's
The
got so
best.
many.
Yeah.
And there's a million on my, I don't know if anyone else uses Goodreads, but I have like 200 some books in my want to read list. And 5 on my bedstand that I'm currently
Make
reading.
sure that's on that list.
That's it. So Night Watch.
Night Watchman, The
Night
Night
Watchman.
Watchman.
All right, that
And
one
it's a
might have
true
to get
story.
bumped up a little bit.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so
so
much.